Welcome, everybody. I'm glad to see such a great showing. I want to introduce to you Dr. Jeff Haynes. We're really happy to have him here to speak to us. He's a professor of history at University of Oregon, and he specializes in Japanese studies. He has recently written a book. I'll just mention that of all the things on his out of his repertoire. It's called City as Subject, Seki Hajime, can't read my own writing, and the Reinvention of Modern Osaka. I just wanted to tell you too that he is also the director of the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies at University of Oregon since 2003, and they applied for a Title VI government grant to form an East Asian National Research Center, and one part of that grant was to set up an Oregon East Asian network, and we found that, I shouldn't say we, I didn't, Dorothy Payton did, another of our Asian Studies Committee members, and she found it online, and so we contacted them, and that was the beginning of a wonderful friendship, I hope. So anyway, we're very happy to have him speak to us today on, let's see, what was that title again? I can't find it. Tradition and Modernity, is that it? Tradition and Modernity in Japan.
Thanks, Sylvia. Thanks, Takako, for inviting me, and Brian and Dorothy and the others on the East Asian Committee. I had an opportunity to meet not too many months ago and to talk about the kinds of activities that we do related to Asia at Oregon, and also to talk about the possibility of coming up here and giving a talk, and I'm really delighted to be here. The thing that I'm going to talk about today, and I changed my title slightly, it was Tradition and Modernity, and now it's Tradition and Modan-ity. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. Those of you who know Japanese will probably see a little pun in there, but I'll explain what that pun is about in a few minutes. Japan is, of course, renowned for its cultural traditions, and I think that that's what a lot of us probably associate it with. Some of those traditions have to do with the sublime, and I'm sure that there are those of you who either practice some of these arts or know about them. Things like ikebana, things like bonsai trees, things like origami, paper folding. A lot of people who associate tradition with Japan associate it with these kind of sublime arts that the Japanese have created, in most cases literally for centuries. We often also associate it with things that are kind of esoteric. Things like cha no yu, the tea ceremony, or Zen Buddhism. But what I think everybody also knows is that one of the things that's particularly interesting about Japan, and I'm sure you've seen movies, you've seen pictures, you've pulled things off the internet. One of the things that's very interesting about Japan is that these traditions tend to persist, and that they end up coexisting with all kinds of new things. And in some ways, that's one of the most interesting things about walking around Japan, which I do about twice a year, where you see things like this, which I would describe as kind of the paradoxical, where you see young women in kimono standing buying tickets for the train or waiting for trains, or as I saw recently, and this is not my photograph, but it could have been my photograph, you see scenes like this. I recently brought a team of people to Nagoya to do a workshop, and while we were leaving Osaka Station going to our hotel, and they were following me because they didn't know the directions, I looked back and they weren't there. And I thought, oh my God, I've lost my team already. And they were actually standing about a block away down the street, kind of still like this, looking at sumo wrestlers who were wandering around because the sumo tournament at that point was in the city of Osaka. But what I want to really take a closer look at today is cultural change in Japan, and I want to look in particular at the way in which modern things and often foreign things have been introduced into Japanese traditional culture. I want to start my story basically in the 1850s. Those of you who know a little bit about Japanese history will know that that's the moment when Commodore Matthew Perry came with his kurobune, his black ships, and started to open Japan up. Some would say like a sardine can. And I'll try to carry the story as best I can into the post-war period, that is post-World War II period. I'm not going to make any guarantees about the end of it. Like a lot of the teachers I'm sure that you've had, I have all kinds of grand plans of what I'm going to do, and I very rarely get through everything that I want to. One more kind of example of contemporary Japan. We've got the sublime, we've got the exotic, we've got the esoteric. We also sometimes have the ridiculous. And of course, this is not actually a building, right? This is not a huge torii over the city of Tokyo, but it's someone's imagination, right, of a way in which kind of traditional culture and modern culture might be mixed, even in contemporary Japan. So if we sort of start the story, the way that I'm going to tell it anyway, the modern story of Japan, in many ways begins with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships in Japan in 1853. And this is a portrait of Commodore Perry, obviously drawn by Japanese at the time. And this is also a portrait of their ships as the Japanese saw them in 1853. This was a really epical moment for Japan, among other things because Japan, although it had not been completely isolated for the previous 250 years, had been relatively isolated from the rest of the world. In fact, it had isolated itself from the rest of the world. So both for the Americans who found their way to Japan and didn't know anything about it, and the Japanese who now saw Americans and didn't know anything about them, there was a culture clash with a capital C in 1853. What the Japanese saw was barbarians on their shores. And when the first barbarians sprung ashore, in fact, they started to clutch their swords, to curse, to scowl, right, and to worry. And the Americans, for their part, also looked at the Japanese and said, who the hell are these guys? This was a really important moment in Japan's history. At the time, Japanese didn't know how important a moment it was going to be, though, because they hadn't yet realized that they were going to be opened up to the world, whether they liked it or not. Between 1853 and 1860, the leaders of Japan at that time, the shoguns and the elders who worked for the shoguns, tried to determine how to respond to this threat from the outside. And that's exactly the way that they saw it. One way in which they dealt with it was by sending an embassy to the West. When they sent the embassy to the West, basically what they were doing is looking for intelligence. Well, who are these guys anyway? Was basically the question that they had. This is a photograph of the embassy on the left. And you can imagine how Americans and Europeans probably responded to them at the time. I mean, these were probably among the most exotic people they had ever seen. The photograph on the right, though, in a way encapsulates the issues that the Japanese faced now in this cultural clash. This is a photograph taken in a naval shipyard in the United States. And you can see that these Japanese are still dressed top knot, two swords, the kimono, they got the whole thing going on, the whole 17th, 18th century Tokugawa thing going on. And what they're now confronted with is a very, very powerful Western nation. And that, in a sense, was exactly the message that these guys now brought back to Japan in 1860, is that these guys may be barbarians, but I'll tell you what, they are really, really powerful barbarians, and we don't have any choice but to deal with them. One of the members of this embassy was this fellow here, whose name is Fukuzawa Yukichi. Following the embassy in 1860, and he was quite a young man when the embassy took place, he became one of Japan's most ardent modernizers. And in his case, modernization, as for many, many or most Japanese in the beginning of the Meiji period, in the beginning of their modern period in their history, he saw modernization very simply as Westernization. And he explains to us why he sees it that way. Let me just read to you a real short quote from Fukuzawa. If we compare the knowledge of the Japanese and Westerners in letters, in techniques, in commerce, or in industry, from the smallest to the largest matter, there is not one thing in which we excel. Outside of the most stupid person in the world, no one would say that our learning or business is on a par with those of the Western countries. Who would compare our carts with their locomotives, or our swords with their pistols? We speak of the yin and the yang and the 5 elements. They've discovered 60 elements. We think we dwell on an immovable plane. They know that the earth is round and moves. We think that our country is the most sacred divine land. They travel about the world, opening lands and establishing countries. In Japan's present conditions, there is nothing in which we may take pride vis-a-vis the West. All that Japan has to be proud of is its scenery. This is the way that this guy looked at the situation that faced Japan in 1860, or around 1860. One of the things that Fukuzawa was trying to articulate at this point was, again, that for Japan to survive in a wider world, it had to modernize, and that for Japan to modernize, all it really needed to do was to westernize. Now, lurking behind that, obviously, is a view of history. And this is a very, very new view of history for Japan. In fact, it's a new way of telling time, both telling time literally and telling time historically. In the Tokugawa period, when people talked about time, when they talked about historical change, they talked about it in terms of cycles, or sometimes in terms of spirals of time. And when things went wrong, they didn't look to the future, they looked to the past. And they said, who in the past has done a really good job of governing? We need to get back to that. But when they encountered Westerners, they encountered a whole new vocabulary about time, about history, and about a word that they now heard and started to use, progress. What they meant, what the Westerners meant when they talked about progress, was there were laws of history, as they explained to the Japanese. And those laws of history dictated that nations went through different stages in their evolution through time. So nations would begin as agriculturalists, then they would become involved in trade and they would commercialize, then they would have an industrial revolution. Well, what the Japanese heard was that all nations had been through that process, and that Japan would be no exception. As they began to talk about this, they also began to embrace a new identity for themselves. One of the new identities, and the one that's most relevant to a discussion of modern Japanese culture, is Bunmei Kaika. And this became kind of the theme song of the late 1860s and the early 1870s. Bunmei Kaika means civilization and enlightenment, but it's premised on a notion of progress. And let me just kind of give you a kind of a thumbnail sketch of the way in which Japanese thought about progress. First of all, they used the term progress probably in much the same way we do, a notion of betterment and improvement. But what they added to that mix, and this also came from the Westerners, was that progress is inevitable. All nations, they heard, progress, okay? All nations inevitably change for the better, and that is dictated by the laws of history. In their case, they also began to believe in a particular notion of progress, and that is what I would call unilinear progress. In other words, they believed that all nations developed in exactly the same way. Now, that was a very convenient notion for them, because what that meant, of course, was that when they looked at progress and when they looked at the Western nations, in essence, what they were seeing was their own future. They were just behind, and these nations were further ahead. One other irony of this, of course, is the way in which they looked at Westerners generally. We've all heard this terrible phrase, all Orientals look alike. Well, to Japanese, all Occidentals looked alike. Every Westerner looked the same. Now, that didn't last for long. Soon they would realize that there were differences among all of these different nations, but in the beginning at least, that's precisely the way that they looked at the world. When they looked at Western nations along a trajectory of progress, they saw the Western nations as more advanced. All they had to do really then was to copy the Western nations, to westernize in order to modernize. There are wonderful, wonderful accounts, in fact, of Japanese who go to the West in the 1860s, late 1860s and early 1870s. And it's almost as if they're walking around with their hands on their hips saying, so this is what the future looks like. How cool is that? I'll take one of those, I'll take one of those, I'll take one of those. And as I think all of you know, from this period, Japan did begin to borrow from the West. They brought in railways, they brought in all kinds of different things, and probably the most important of the things that they brought in was clocks. But before we talk about that stuff, before we talk about the stuff that they brought in, what I want to emphasize is how epical a change this was for Japan culturally. One of the things that happened soon after this embassy in 1868 was that Japan experienced a revolution. It was an aristocratic revolution. Samurai brought down the Tokugawa shoguns, and they tried to create a modern nation state modeled on the Western nation states, Britain, the United States, France, Germany, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that they realized, however, was that they were going to have to modernize extremely, extremely quickly. They had, in order to center their new nation state, put the emperor back on the throne. The reason they put the emperor back on the throne was because the emperor was a person with whom all Japanese could identify as a kind of symbol of power, authority, and history. Now, in 1872, this is what the emperor looked like. And at some point, around 1872, these new Meiji leaders looked at that emperor and said, I don't know about you guys, but when I look at him, he just doesn't shout modernity. He doesn't, you know, who in the world in the West is going to be threatened by a guy who's wandering around in robes that were first designed in the 8th century? Probably no one. So they gave the emperor new clothes. This is what he looked like in 1873. The emperor has been westernized. The emperor has been made into an icon of national power and strength. That is the story, or part of the story, at least, of the beginnings of Japan's modernization in the Meiji period. Now, we could talk about the elites of Japan and the way in which they now began to modernize Japan and its government and its military, et cetera, but that's not really the interest that I have, and it's not the subject of this talk. What I really want to do is not just to look at the elite leadership, but to ask, how was it that modernization as westernization now affected people across Japan? What things in their lives changed? And that's what we're going to be looking at for the next few minutes. One of the ways in which the leadership did help people to accept the inevitability of more modern and Western change was by modeling it. You can imagine, there was no Google, there was no telephone, right? There's very little knowledge of the West among most Japanese people in the early 1870s. So in a sense, what the leadership needed to do was to bring the West to Japan, to bring the modern to Japan, and to show it off. They also needed to give themselves a little time to adjust to this new world in which they were going to live. One of the ways in which they did that was by constructing a diplomatic dwelling called the Rokumeikan, and this building on the left is that structure. It's a Western-style, Italianate kind of villa. It was about 15,000 square feet. It had a ballroom, a music room, a billiard room. It had suites for guests. It had an alabaster bathtub. And it was at this building that the Japanese leadership would now conduct all kinds of balls and parties, diplomatic gatherings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And whenever they did that, they tried to appear modern and they tried to appear Western. So the photograph on the right, and I know it's kind of difficult to see in this light, the photograph on the right is of a bunch of Japanese dressed up for a Western-style ball, obviously in Western-style clothes. What that was meant to do, again, was to model Western things and to model modernity for the Japanese. What the government also did was actually literally to build a new residential neighborhood that kind of shouted modernity. You're all probably familiar, those of you who know anything about Japan are familiar with a place called the Ginza. The Ginza today is an entertainment quarter, it's a fashion quarter in the center of Tokyo. In this period, in the early 1870s, what had been there, and what had been there was not an entertainment quarter, what had been there burned down. Well, the Japanese leadership at that point, figuratively speaking at least, put that yellow tape around the entire area and said, keep out. Hired a British architect, and they built a place that came to be known as Ginza Bricktown. About 1,000 brick dwellings and businesses, sidewalks, gas lamps. It almost seems like a kind of theme park that they built. And I think what they had in their minds when they did this, and this is putting some ideas into their heads, but I don't think too many. I think what they had in mind was that the people of Tokyo would now come to Ginza Bricktown and they would look around and they would say, wow, this is modern, right? We need to do the same thing, right? And Mr. Japan would turn to Mrs. Japan and go, honey, we're going to go home, we're going to rip down that old house, and we're going to put up a brick dwelling just like this. And the hope was that modernity was almost like a virus, that you would go to this place, you'd catch the virus, you would go home, and the virus would spread throughout the city. Well, actually, that didn't happen. A few brick buildings went up here and there, but Tokyo was not transformed. At this point, literally and figuratively, the Japanese leadership was looking at Japan as a kind of facsimile of the West. They also began to introduce all kinds of new stuff at this moment in time. One really important thing that they introduced was the clock. And the clock was important, among other things, for exactly the reason that I've been suggesting before, that when Japanese took on this notion of modernization and westernization, they also took on a different notion of time and a different notion of history. They began to look at history in a linear way, and it's moving forward and things are getting inevitably better. The clock is a key piece of that. And clocks now were introduced all across Japan. They were introduced along with what were known at the time as the 7 tools of civilization and enlightenment. There were 7 particular technologies that Japanese associated directly and reflexively with modernization and westernization. Railways was the first of those. Dirigible balloons was a second. Gas lights, the postal system, industrial expos, photography, and newspapers. All of those things were introduced to Japan, and the notion was that if you had those 7 tools of civilization and enlightenment, that Japan would move forward rapidly and would ultimately catch up with the West. So how were people's lives affected at a kind of practical level? Certainly introducing the clock helps. But there were a whole variety of other things that were introduced in every aspect of people's lives that really transformed their lives. And I think it would be fascinating to be kind of a fly on the, would have been fascinating to be a fly on the wall in the 1870s and the 1880s as people are trying to adjust to all of the new technologies and all the new stuff that is appearing in their lives. So new clothes, for example. People are now wearing coats and dresses and pants and shoes and hats and umbrellas, all kinds of things that they'd never seen before. All kinds of new furniture is being introduced. Chairs, glass windows, sofas, oil lamps, all of those things now become part of people's lives. Transportation and communications completely changed. So you now have railways, telegraph, you have carriages, rickshaws, bicycles, electricity is introduced, telephones come to Japan, and all this in a very, very short period of time. Food, too. Milk and meat are introduced into the Japanese diet, as was bread. And fashions also began to change. So women began to adopt new hairstyles, as did men. And you'll notice that this kid on the right doesn't have a top knot. He's cut his hair really short. And it was said at the time, there was a saying at the time, that if you cut your hair short like this, and if you walked up and you tapped on that head and listened carefully, it echoed back, Bunmei Kaika, Bunmei Kaika, Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, civilization and enlightenment. The notion being, of course, that even these little things were going to change people's lives. Now, we've been talking mainly about new stuff. We've been talking mainly about new aspects of culture. But this was also a time of the Japanese, what the Japanese called enlightenment, the kaika part of Bunmei Kaika. All kinds of new ideas also were introduced from the West to Japan at this point. Democracy, for example, got introduced into the Japanese vocabulary. But two really key things that were introduced were the notions of individualism and self-help. We're talking about a society that had prided itself on its group behavior, and it now sees that in the West, what is prized is individual behavior and entrepreneurship. So, for example, the book Robinson Crusoe became a bestseller in Japan in the late Meiji period. Why? Because you have here a guy left on his own, a castaway, right, who makes a life for himself. Another book, another American book by a guy by the name of Samuel Smiles called Self-Help was picked up by businessmen in the period who wanted to model Americans for notions of entrepreneurship. What we see in Japan, in other words, is the introduction of all kinds of new stuff, all kinds of new ideas in a rush, and at least up to this point, in a very, very kind of facile way. People really did believe, in the beginning of the Meiji period particularly, that simply copying the West would somehow make Japan more Western. And I swear, when people were at the Rokumeikan wearing those top hats, that they believed that somehow putting that hat on, somehow in that hat was contained notions of modernity and of modern civilization, and that if you put the hat on your head, you kind of trapped those things inside, and it would somehow seep into your brain. Now, again, I'm putting words into their mouths, but I think that that's precisely the facile way in which people looked at modernization and westernization in the beginning. But they realized quite rapidly, by the late 1880s and the early 1890s, that it wasn't quite that simple. They realized that the Western nations were actually very different from one another, and that their cultures were very different from one another. And one of the things that they realized when they spoke to people from these nations is that these people hadn't run willy-nilly, kind of giving up their previous identity and embracing some abstract Western ideal, that actually what they had done is to try and keep their kind of feet on the ground, to sink roots with tradition. And the Japanese began to think that that needed to be part of modernizing their culture too, that they needed to have some sense of their own traditions and also some sense of the challenges of the future. What that meant, practically speaking, is that you begin to see this mix now between tradition and modernity, kind of coexisting in a modernizing Japan. So in the first picture there on the left, what you can see is a very, very modern Western building. And right in front of it, you can see something that was really quintessentially Japanese, although relatively modern, the rickshaw. I'm sitting in front of that modern building. And this is taken at a time when other kinds of motorized transportation already existed. It's a little bit difficult, maybe very difficult. I don't know how well you can see those pictures at all. In the photograph on the right, what you can see is people walking with geta and wearing kimono, but you can also see that they're wearing something else that is not associated necessarily with Japan, and that is the bowler hat. You see this kind of weird mix appearing in Japan in the 1890s, and I think what it is in a way is a gesture about the Japanese appreciation of the complexity of achieving progress. That as you move forward and you adopt new stuff and new technologies and new ideas, you also have to keep a foot in the past. You have to keep with your own traditions, and that's exactly what people tried to do. That's the 1890s there. As the 1890s move forward and as Japan moves into the 20th century, one thing that I think most of you probably know is that Japan was becoming much more powerful, almost by the year. Japan would go to war several times in this period, first with the Chinese in 1894, then with the Russians in 1904. At each one of those moments, it was becoming more and more powerful. It was seeing itself as more and more advanced. It was identifying with the Western nations. But the moment when Japan really surged forward was an ironic moment when you look at it from the perspective of the Europeans particularly, and that was World War I. World War I, I think you all know, was fought mainly in Europe. It was a vicious war, which literally and figuratively brought the European nations to their knees. What most of us don't know, or at least don't think about, is that while the European nations were falling to their knees, two nations were rising to their feet. One is the United States, and the other is Japan. At the beginning of World War I in 1914, Japan was a debtor nation. It owed money to the Americans and to the Europeans, largely for technologies that it was importing to Japan. By 1916, that is 2 years into the war, Japan was a creditor nation. It was loaning money. Japan, in other words, had become rich, and it had become rich very, very quick. As it was becoming rich, it was also changing incredibly rapidly. One of my favorite cartoons actually lampoons that very phenomenon. I don't know how well, again, you can see this. This is a cartoon called Ozone. What you need to know about the Japanese language in order to understand the humor in it is that there are homophones in Japanese. That is, there are words that sound alike but have different meanings, okay? That's the premise of this thing. The basic story here, and you can see this old guy wearing a kimono. He's what they call Maidareto no Shonin. He is a merchant of the apron clique. In other words, he represents Japan's commercial past. He's one of the old guys who's still working in the old ways. The guy sitting in the chair there, who he has come to visit, is called a haikara, a high collar, okay? He's wearing a high white collar, like American businessmen would at the time. The old guy has basically walked into the new guy's office, and he says, "Wow, look at all this stuff." And the cartoonist has crammed about as many modern Western things as you could possibly get into that one little frame there. There's a swivel chair. I don't know what all you can see there. There's a swivel chair. There's a modern desk. There are books. There's an inbox, outbox. There's a fan. There's an oriental rug. There are even things that Japanese wouldn't be able to identify because they're so new. One of them is down in the left-hand corner. You see it's got Japanese writing on it. It's been identified by the cartoonist because people wouldn't know what it was, and it's a refrigerator. Well, the old guy, as it turns out, he hasn't been, sleeping for the last, 20 or 30 years. He knows that this stuff exists. He just doesn't have it, and he hasn't embraced Westernization to the degree that this guy has. But there's one thing that he can identify, and that's that thing he's pointing at on top of the desk, right here. He says, I've seen all this other stuff, but what's that up there? And the guy says, it's an ozone-producing device. And he goes, a what? And the haikara explains that it is a device that purifies the air in the room. And when it purifies the air in the room, purifies the ozone, he can work better and more efficiently. He can work like at the speed of 10 men, right, as being one man. What he doesn't know is that the old guy hasn't heard any of the explanation. All he heard was the name of the device, ozone, which is a homophone. There's another word that sounds kind of like that, ozone, in Japanese, heavy business losses. So what he thinks the guy's introduced is a machine that actually creates heavy business losses. And he thinks, what a weird and wonderful world we live in. You actually create business losses when you want to. Well, what I'm talking about, obviously, is a moment in the 1910s when Japan is going through a kind of rush of modernization, and it's becoming very complicated because you still see these vestiges of the past, like this Maidareto no Shonin, by this merchant of the apron clique, and at the same time you see these haikara. There are moments also, though, in history when events change the world, and sometimes those events are natural catastrophes. You all know about the great Hanshin earthquake in the 1990s, and I'm sure everybody knows about the great earthquake on 3/11 2 years ago. I was actually in Japan for that earthquake. I was in Kyoto in a hotel, and I felt it there, and that is hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the epicenter. Well, there was one such event that kind of made people think about the course of their history in 1923. That's a seismological reading. Boom, 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 up and down, okay? What that represents is an 8.9 earthquake. An 8.9 earthquake hit the cities of Tokyo and Yokohama, the capital and the largest port city. That hit those cities on September 1st, 1923 at 11:58 a.m. What do you think people were probably doing at 11:58 a.m.? What would you be doing at 11:58 or thinking about at 11:58 a.m.? Lunch. Let's make lunch, right? Well, everybody lit fires for lunch. So you can imagine what a catastrophe this was. We're talking about a wooden city, 2 wooden cities, right, which now go up in flames. The flames were so intense that there were literally tornadoes of fire in Tokyo. One of those tornadoes of fire went down the Sumida River, made a turn quickly to the east, and went into a plaza where people had taken shelter, or so they thought, in a military uniform depot. It exploded. We don't know exactly how many people were killed, but possibly 40,000 people in that site alone. 140,000 people died in this disaster related to the earthquake, but mainly related to the fire. On the left, there's a picture of the fires themselves, which were humongous. On the right, we have a map that the Japanese used to try to communicate the scale of the disaster, because people just didn't get it in the West, how big this was. This is the London fire, the famous London fire. This is the famous Chicago fire. This is the San Francisco earthquake. This is the Great Kanto earthquake. This was a massive disaster. Now, my purpose now is not to talk about the disaster itself, though, but to talk about the effect that it had on people at the time culturally. As you can imagine, a lot of people, even people who were not superstitious, said the gods are speaking to us. And of course, Japan is a place where the gods are everywhere. The Shinto gods are everywhere. Some people said the gods are speaking to us, and what they're saying is we haven't modernized nearly enough. We need to really move more rapidly forward. Others said exactly the opposite. We've lost touch with who we are. In the beginning, at least, those who advocated the kind of let's modernize more and more and more position tended to take the fore. And in the years following the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, we see a kind of massive attempt to modernize urban culture, particularly in Japan. And when that urban culture was being modernized, the model that people used, and this is directly related to that World War I example I was giving before, was the United States. When those 2 nations rose to their feet during the middle of World War I, they looked at one another, and they also began to borrow with one another. For the most part, Japanese are importing ideas from the United States, but the Americans were also being influenced by Japan at this time. So when Japanese thought about modern urban culture, they thought about the United States. And here are kind of 2 typical photographs of the United States, of big buildings in a big city, and also of flappers wandering down the streets of Chicago or of New York. Japan did not look utterly different than this in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. And it was a point when Japanese no longer talked about modernization, but they talked about Modan, the Modan. They wanted to become Modan. It's a foreign loan word. They're taking the word modernity and they are Japanizing the word. And I've then now created this little pun of Modan-ity, right? And what they meant by that was that they wanted, almost literally, to become a facsimile of American urban culture in this period, right down to this woman on the right, and those characters say Modan, right, smoking a cigarette and looking like she comes off the streets of Chicago in this period. What also happened is that people celebrated this modernity to such a degree that it really began to worry people in Japanese culture. And in particular, what they began to do was to develop a kind of cultural extreme that Japanese at the time described as ero-guro nonsense. Erotic, grotesque nonsense. Now, what we might think of as erotic and grotesque wasn't necessarily what someone in 1930s Japan thought of as erotic and grotesque. But these are two scenes that kind of capture that moment. One is obviously dancers, and this isn't nearly the most erotic picture that I could have chosen, but I you know, for a large audience of people I don't know, this is the one that I'm going to use. And on the right, what you have is a kind of scene that really disturbed people at the time, and particularly modern women, modern girls as they were called at the time. Modern girls who would become the future mothers of Japan, sitting around in a bar, smoking cigarettes, listening to jazz music, drinking electric brandy cocktails, dancing the tango. I mean, it's the downfall of Japanese civilization, okay? But let me go back to this picture again and then onto this one. At this moment in time, the kind of icons of Modan culture were identified as the symbols of youth. They were called Modan garu and Modan boy, modern girls and modern boys. Here is a picture of modern girls probably wandering around on the Ginza, and modern boys dressed up in their Western finest. Some Japanese looked at these modern figures and said, now we're catching up with the West. But some people looked at these Western figures and says, I don't know. If this is the youth of Japan today, what's the future going to look like for us? It wasn't a pleasant thought. It was a kind of unnerving thought. This was so interesting to people at the time that actually a new social science appeared. And that new social science was called modernology, Kogengaku. Its main proponent was a guy by the name of Kon Wajiro. What Kon Wajiro did basically was what I've often described as social scientific stalking. He sent researchers out into the field to places like the Ginza, where he knew that modern boys and modern girls would be hanging out, and he had them take notes and literally follow them around. So in this book, Modernology, there are little maps that say, you know, they went to this store window and they stayed for 20 seconds, and then they went over here and they stayed for 30 seconds more, and they were wearing these kinds of shoes and this kind of haircut and this kind of belt and this kind of coat. In other words, what he's doing is he is observing cultural change. And I believe that what Kon Wajiro and other modernologists believe that they were actually doing is witnessing the evolution of Japanese society. And they had to have evidence to show how exactly it was evolving. Again, when it took on this more extreme form, where people began to look at those modern boys and modern girls, and they only saw dissipation, and they only saw kind of social corruption, then they really began to get worried. Now, that moment was the mid-1930s, and as I think many of you know, at that moment in time, Japanese leaders were no longer liberals. They were no longer advocating democracy. They were conservatives. They were nationalists. They wanted nothing more than to make Japan into a powerful nation, just as powerful as the Western powers, and that meant colonizing other nations. It meant moving in a conservative direction within Japan. So these kinds of things really, really disturbed them. As Japan went to war in the late 1930s, first in China and then in the early 1940s with the United States and the other allied powers, needless to say, this antipathy that they had for modern Western culture just intensified. By the time we get to the middle of World War II, you don't see modern girls anymore. In fact, there's a very, very famous photograph of a picture that was hung at the entrance to a neighborhood in Tokyo that has a kind of caricature of a modern girl with her hair all kind of stringy and lots of makeup on, and it says, "No modern girls beyond this point." Instead, they moved from being moga to wearing mompe, to wearing these kind of plain, traditional trousers. What that means, of course, is that Japan, once again, is going through a huge cultural change. Now, fast forward to the end of this war. Fast forward to 1945. I think you all know what happened at the end of this war. And it wasn't just the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that spoke to the fate of Japan, but also the fire bombings of 66 cities in Japan, which took just as many lives as those two bombings combined. What happened following that, of course, is that Japan entered a new chapter in its history. And that new chapter brought them even closer together than they had been with the United States, and even closer to American culture than they had been previously. Japan was occupied by the United States for 7 full years, from 1945 to 1952. There's a big story, of course, to be told about all of the different effects that had on Japan, including the kind of transformation of Japanese government and the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for our story, it's really important, I think, also to look at the cultural changes that went with this new identity with the United States. It's a great irony of history, and I'm not sure that we have a really succinct answer for it, but the Japanese, you might have thought, would resist this occupation, but it was exactly the opposite. As John Dowers, one of the most famous historians of Japan, puts it, they embraced defeat. They embraced defeat for lots and lots of different reasons, including the fact that they were simply utterly exhausted by 1945. This war had taken a toll on Japanese that is indescribable. As a result, when MacArthur arrived, and MacArthur made it clear that he was going to transform Japan and to make it great once again, they embraced this idea. And if you talk to people to this day about General MacArthur, they're overwhelmingly positive. But they embraced the culture in a variety of different ways. One, they realized that they needed now to begin to speak English. They needed to begin to read English, that this was going to become the lingua franca for them in the future. And very, very early in the occupation period, in 1946 or 1947, this textbook came out, this kind of brochure textbook came out, and it sold like hotcakes all across Japan. And if you had been in Japan in 1946 or 47, you would have noticed that people all over Japan would have mastered all of the basic phrases in that textbook. They also began to model American life. They began to assume that what they needed to do, as they had needed to become more Western in the Meiji period, now they needed to become more American. And they literally modeled America. At one point outside of Osaka, there was what was called an American Expo. And what it was designed to do was to show Japanese kind of some of the monuments of American life. If you look at this picture here, it shows you some of the buildings that went up in that expo. And the people are about this high, right here. So these are huge, models that they have put up. This was also a period when the Japanese began to import American cinematic culture. Hollywood became important to Japanese kind of modeling their own future, and probably the most famous actress at the time was Audrey Hepburn. So this is a picture of Audrey Hepburn, the influence of Hollywood. Japanese then took up these same styles in their own films in the immediate post-war period, and you begin to see American styles appearing in Japanese films, and then on Japanese streets you begin to see people aping the styles that they've seen in American films and in Japanese films, which take an American style. One way of characterizing what happened at this point is as a kind of cultural revolution, and some historians have described it, in fact, as Japan's American cultural revolution, whereby you began to see young women looking just as much like New Yorkers as anything, wandering around the streets of Tokyo, Osaka, and other large cities. It was also a period when not only the good side, but as many Japanese saw it, the bad side of America came to Japan. And in particular, a kind of shady youth group, almost like the people thought of it as kind of a cult called the Sun Tribes, began to appear. And they were into sex, drugs, and not rock and roll, but at this time, sex, drugs, and jazz. By the time we get to the mid-1950s, Japanese were also trying to ape the way that Americans lived. including the kind of domestic environments in which they live. So they're beginning to have vacuum cleaners and washing machines and refrigerators. But the most important of the new technologies, of course, is the television. And by the mid-1950s, everyone aspired to have a television. By the late 1950s, many Japanese were actually able to acquire at least black and white sets. And what they would have seen on television is a really interesting story in itself. In alternating weeks, if you were watching Japanese television in the late 1950s, one week you would have seen the Walt Disney Show, translation obviously, the Walt Disney Show, and in the alternating week you would have seen professional wrestling. And what it is in a way is a metaphor for the dilemma that Japanese saw themselves in, the kind of cultural dilemma. On the one hand, they now revere the United States, and when they're looking at the Walt Disney Show, they're dreaming about making Japan into a kind of big Disneyland, if you will. But what that also suggested, of course, is that they were going to lose their identity in the process. So in alternating weeks, there would be pro wrestling, and virtually every week, the two same wrestlers wrestled. Rikidozan and Destroya. Destroya was an American wrestler. Rikidozan was a Japanese wrestler. Who do you think won every week? Rikidozan, right? It's this reminder, right? We are still strong. We still are a people, right? We can survive on our own. Now, fast forward once again, and I think I'm just about on time, which is really unusual for me. If we fast forward again roughly to the contemporary day, the one other point that I would make is that, of course, the American influence on Japan, the cultural influence on Japan, continues to be incredibly great. But what's happening at the same time, and I think many of you are aware of this and many of you are probably participants in it, is that Japanese culture has begun to come to the United States. And what we're beginning to see is a kind of reverse of the cultural flows. This has been happening for a long time now. In the mid-1990s, I used to teach a course on Japanese popular culture. And for the first about 6 weeks of the quarter, we did the kind of history of Japanese popular culture. Things like I was showing you before, at which point my students had almost nothing to say. They were just sitting taking notes because they didn't know anything about it. When we got to contemporary Japanese popular culture, I told them at one point, about 2 or 3 lectures into it, that I should be sitting in the audience and they should be up here lecturing, because they knew a hell of a lot more about it than I did. But what we've seen, obviously, in a variety of different ways is the introduction of Japanese culture to the United States. And you could think of you can probably think of many more ways in which this influence has taken place than I can. But one of them, the Uniqlo clothing manufacturer, now has outlets in New York where they sell T-shirts that were originally designed in the United States, and you get this kind of reverse cultural flow. People have become so creative with sushi now that they're making sushi cakes, like this one that I found just rooting around on the internet. And here's something you can probably really identify with, some of you, right? That some of you have actually taken on Japanese identities, like this guy who is so obsessed with Dragon Ball that he's actually now, Dragon Ball apes American life. If you're interested in this particular phenomenon, and I put up the cover of this book, Roland Keltz has written a wonderful book called Japan America, where he looks at all of the ways in which manga and anime and other things have influenced the United States. So anyway, that's the story, the sweeping story, as I see it anyway, of culture and modernity in Japan, roughly from the 1850s forward. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Haynes. And I think we are going to have cookies and coffee and a little reception, but before we disperse, why don't we allow you to ask a few questions? Do any of you have any questions for Dr. Haynes? Well, I do. If you don't mind. You talked a lot about, just sort of, you talked in a grand sweep, and that's the kind of lecture it was. But I was wondering how deep that went, that interest in America and, you know, throughout the 20th century before, say, before the 1950s, before the end of the war?
How deep?
How
before
deep
the
did
war?
it go? Yeah, how deep did it go? Was it just certain people, or was it general popular culture?
Well, it's a good question, but it's a difficult question to answer. The kind of urban cultural phenomena that I was talking about, particularly in the 1920s and the 1930s, where you see a moga on the streets of Tokyo looking like flappers from Chicago or New York, that probably didn't run very deep. In one sense. In another sense, it did. It didn't run very deep in the sense that it didn't touch the entire population. What it touched was an elite portion of the population. So this would have been middle-class urbanites, probably the sons and daughters of successful businessmen, men who had become very rapidly successful during World War I. But what's interesting about the story of the popularization of American culture is that it does begin kind of incrementally to reach down further into the population. Whether it reaches out into the countryside is another question. And I mean, there's a lot of research done that says that families whose daughters had gone from the countryside into the city and then returned with haircuts like this and clothes like this basically got depressed and said, I've lost my daughter, that's the end of life as we know it. For working class people, though, and I've actually done research on this in Osaka, you do begin to see the impact of American life on working class families. But you see it again in incremental ways. They didn't have the income to go out and buy all of this clothing or to go out to bars and these kinds of entertainments, but they did have enough money to go to the movies. And we know that because whenever workers were asked to participate in surveys, they were offered a gift. And usually that gift was movie tickets. Movie tickets were dear. They could afford them. They knew what movies were, and they went whenever they could. So what happens, I think, is incrementally it has an influence on the rest of the population.
Do you want to, let's see, maybe does this loosen up, and can you just talk loud? Okay.
In post-war Japan, was there any backlash against American popular culture or any push for austerity within Japanese culture itself?
Yeah. And I mean, and again, you know, when you tell it in these big sweeping terms, it makes it seem like there's this avalanche of Americanization. In fact, it was much more painful and much slower than the picture that I gave you, among other things because of the condition Japan found itself in 1945. What you want to remember is that something like 3 million lives, Japanese lives, were lost in the war. 2 million soldiers, 1 million civilians, a quarter of the infrastructure, 66 of Japan's largest cities were bombed they were obliterated. They had no navy, they had no ships by the end of the war. The New York Times predicted in 1945 that Japan would become a small regional economy. Now, of course, what we know is that Japan became a superpower, an economic superpower. At least. But that process took quite a while, and it really took until the early 1960s. Up until the mid-1950s, people were saving. Whatever money they made, they saved. So they weren't spending stuff. From 1955, though, incrementally, they began to spend. So you begin to see what was called the bright life in 1955. A lot of people who have enough income now that they feel safe, they can buy some of these domestic technologies. They reach another level in the 1960s. And in the middle of the 1960s, as I think some of you know, Japan kind of had its coming out party, the post-war coming out party, and that was the Olympics in 1964. That's when the bullet train went in. That's when Japanese expressways went in. That's when Tonga Kenzo designed this building that looks like a phoenix rising from the ashes. That was the moment Japan said, we're back. We're back big time. And of course, from that point on, in the period of what's called high-speed growth, Japan accelerated its cultural growth as well. But I don't think it was really until the 1980s that we see Japan and Japanese kind of embracing the spending and cultural extravagance during the bubble economy. Up to that point, you still see this notion that you need to save, but you should spend on some things. In the 1980s, I swear, people just went hog wild. and we're spending money like crazy, and it really looked like a place of extravagance. And of course, that proved to be the wrong decision, because this asset bubble collapsed, and people ended up losing an awful lot of money. I'm not sure if that answers your question exactly, but.
You talked about modernity being westernization, and then post-war the Americanization. But do you see much influence of France and England and other Western countries prior to the war? Or is it even then primarily American?
During the period of westernization in the Meiji period, this is much broader. I think personally, and I have to admit, I mean, there are debates among historians about this. My position is that from 1914, 1916 or so forward, the American influence becomes predominant. But up to that point, you're absolutely right, that it is a much more broad-based look at the West. And what they're doing is borrowing from different places. You know, so they'll go to one place for the Navy, one place for the Army, one place for one kind of technology, and they're not really distinguishing among them. Where you do see that kind of broadening again is during the bubble economy. During the bubble economy, people who had, when they traveled, had generally gone to the United States. When I talked to Japanese in the mid-'70s when I first arrived there, really into the early '80s, if they were going to go travel abroad, almost always they were going to go to Hawaii, or they were going to go to LA or San Francisco. Not in the mid-'80s, not during the bubble economy. That whole kind of landscape, that tourism landscape, shifted to Europe. Which, you know, and so you do see that kind of, and then you see those kinds of cultural influences coming to Japan. French food, you know, for example, and some of the highest rated Michelin, you know, Michelin starred restaurants are in Tokyo. That's probably when that began.
Okay, I see two more hands. Oh, I see three. Let's have three quick questions, and then let's call it quits. You can talk to him individually after that. So let's start with you.
Do you think on the onset of World War II that possible Japan's backlash to America could have been them wanting to prove how great they were with modernization, but applying their own traditions to it?
So you're basically talking about, you're asking about why bomb Pearl Harbor? Is that kind of what?
Well, sort of like, because I'm just thinking because like on World War II, you know, they decided to go against the U.S. Do you think that there could have been an influence of them being like, you know, like, hey, look at us, look at what we've done with your technology, we've been great? Oh,
absolutely, absolutely. And actually, there were earlier examples of exactly that same thing. We talked about Perry coming in 1853. In 1857, one of the elders of the shogun's government suggested a policy that Japan should adopt. And basically it went like this. He said he was convinced that the Westerners were more powerful in technology, that they were more powerful in their governments, but that they were inferior to Japanese culturally. So he suggested the plan should be we send this embassy to the West, we get really good intelligence, we bring that stuff back home, we make all of this stuff, right, or we bring it to Japan somehow. We make it better because we're superior anyway, and then we use it to turn the tables on them. What you certainly do see in the 1930s, too, is a sense on the part of Japanese, not only of their cultural superiority, but a sense of their racial superiority, and that's also leavened into this mix, you know, that goes into you know, the war with the United States. They did not expect it to be the war that it became, this war without mercy in the Pacific. Among other things, they had convinced themselves that Americans were a bunch of wimps. They were a bunch of, you know, farm boys. You'd send them out into the Pacific, and they'd get mosquito bites, and they'd cry for their mommies and want to go home. Well, it didn't turn out that way, right? So this was an unexpected result, and a kind of cultural misunderstanding that they had of Americans.
Good question. Who's the other person? There you are.
How did Japan reconcile Americanization with their past morals, or did they kind of replace their past values and culture with American?
So if we go back to the Meiji period, to the 1860s, part of this I think is very pragmatic. There were kind of one response the Japanese had after Perry arrived and after they sent the embassy to the West, and as they got to know how powerful these Westerners were, one of the responses that they had was, pardon the expression, holy shit. I mean, we're screwed. These guys have ships, they have big armies, they are voracious expansionists. I mean, this is the age of imperialism, right? These guys are carving out, as Fukuzawa put it, carving out countries all over the globe. And Japan looked at that situation and said to themselves, who's next? We're next. We better respond to this really quick. And this is where this idea of progress becomes very convenient. I mean, it's really simplistic when you think about it, that for them to say all nations develop in exactly the same way and we're just like them. Because the convenient part of this is that because all that requires now is to catch up, right? To catch up to the West. But in order to accomplish that, what you have to do is to repudiate the past. And that's exactly what they did, is they repudiated their past and embraced this future. By the 1880s, and this was left out of my story, and it would be if we were telling a more expansive story, by the 1880s they realized that. Japanese realized that if they continued simply to embrace the West, they were going to lose a sense of who they were as people. And that who they were as people involved both morals and values and things that came from the past. And what you begin to see is them implanting those things in their present world from the 1880s forward, but also trying to still embrace technology, so kind of have the best of both of those worlds. But you're absolutely right. I mean, people must have woken up, some of them, and said, who am I? I use a book, actually, that might be interesting for you guys to read. It's about everyday life. It's about a housewife called Nakano Makiko. I use this in a lot of my classes because it's called Makiko's Diary. It's just her diary in the early Meiji period. And what's astounding about it is it's just an everyday person talking about the way in which this rapidly changing and modernizing world affects her life. Meat gets introduced into the diet, electric lights into her house. She's using new forms of transportation. It was just a kind of mind-blowing experience for Japanese. And what ultimately is keeping them steady, of course, is that they try now also to root themselves in their own traditions. But one of the other things that they do is they invent tradition. And it's a kind of an odd way of terming it, but they literally invent tradition. So they say to themselves, we need to be rooted in the past. So we have to have icons that represent our collective past. There's a shrine in Kyoto called the Heian Shrine. The Heian Shrine, when you look at it, looks like it belongs to the Heian period, which is way, way back in the 9th and the 10th centuries. The shrine was built in the 1890s. It's made to look that way because what it is doing is becoming a kind of icon of Japan's commitment to tradition. And I guarantee you, if you went to the Heian Shrine today and you interviewed Japanese people as they got out of tourist buses and said, when was the Heian Shrine built? They would go, sa, so desu ne. And then they would say like 1,000 years ago or 1,200 years ago. And actually, the leaders of Japan would be high-fiving one another like crazy if they thought that was happening, because what they had done is invented a tradition. They created a symbol of the long history and tradition of Japan.
Okay, so I promise for one, these are great questions, and you can see he could go on forever. There was one last question that, oh,
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
I basically was just curious as to, so the Japanese people were using Western civilization as a model for going into the future.
Yeah.
They saw it as where they should be going. At any point, did they have kind of a milestone, like to defeat a superpower on the world stage, and then they would feel at equal footing? And then, if they hit this milestone, would they did they have a model proposed for after that?
Well, it's a very good question, and actually, there were two slogans actually in the Meiji period. One was Bunmei Kaika that we talked about, civilization and enlightenment. The other one was Fukoku Kyohei, a wealthy country with a powerful military. They're pursuing these things in parallel. As they were developing the wealthy country, the powerful military, they were asking themselves, how can we compare ourselves to the Western powers? What is it that they do that we need to do that will demonstrate to them that we're just as advanced and as powerful as they are? Well, they figured this out pretty quick, right? We become expansionist, we become imperialists, and we go to war. So in 1894, 95, they go to war with the Chinese, right? And they win the war. They overwhelm the Chinese in the war. It was a big shock to the Western powers. And the Western powers did not accept that. In what's called the Triple Intervention, 3 of the Western powers now emasculated the Japanese victory and said, you have to give back some of the land. Basically said to them, you know, here's the deal. We're more powerful than you are. What the Japanese thought at the moment they were going to war was that it was kind of like a fraternity, right? And once they had accomplished the victory in this war, that they'd be admitted to the fraternity. But what these guys are saying is, I'm sorry guys, you're still not ready to be a member. So what do? They double down, and they now develop their economy and their military even more intensively in the period between 1894-95 and 1904-1905. The second time they go to war with a Western power. They go to war with Russia. Sink the fleet, right? And they beat the Russians right off the table. All that did, in essence, was to scare the crap out of the West. And one of the things I think that actually happens with Japan is they become more cynical. They realize that they have to modernize on their own terms and that they have to nationalize on their own terms. That they're not going to be admitted to this fraternity, and that their view of Westernization as modernization was kind of naive. So they develop more complex notions of what it means to be modern, and they develop a kind of alternate path, as they see it, to modernity. By the 1930s, of course, they've convinced themselves that they are superior in every respect. And the war, in many ways, was a humongous mistake in judgment. Japanese thought that they would go to war, and that because they were in alliance with Germany and Italy, that the war would be over quickly. They would give back a lot of the territory that they'd taken all across the Pacific, and that would be that. Well, that didn't happen. So the war that was supposed to be over, say, in 1942, didn't end until 1945, by which time they're decimated all of their resources. So, you know, there is exactly that kind of thing going on in their heads as well.
Okay, so great questions, all of them. So thank you, Dr. Haynes, for spending time with us.
Thanks for your attention.